Welcome back, and I'm so sorry the video keeps cutting us off. I'm obviously it's another day. I don't have wardrobe change here, but I'm going to kind of back up a little. Edgar just did the tag routine with his dogs. Obviously, Claude knows he's onto him. It upset Claude. In fact, that's right where I'm going to start. Drop it, Claude said, drop it. He looked again toward the Dutch doors and then faced into the workshop and then got control of himself and took a breath and looked steadily at Edgar. A muscle under his left eye was jerking. What the hell anyway, he said, and he stalked out of the barn. Edgar began turning in the aisle, performing a weird, exhilarated dance. He signed a broad release, and the downed dogs scrambled to their feet and stirred around Mr. Benson. His mother allowed herself an angry look at him, but when she spoke, her voice was cool and modulated. Edgar, she said, would you put these dogs back in their pens? I think we've seen enough. Have you ever, as a mom, done that to your kids? Like, I remember I used to, if my kids were more afraid of me whispering, I think we'll talk about this later, than they were of, I wasn't a yeller, right? But, oh my gosh, I can just totally picture her face. Did you see it? He signed. Did you see his face? I certainly did. That was extraordinary, Mr. Benson said. What was that? Well, I haven't seen that before myself, Dr. Papineau said, and I've watched these dogs do some pretty unusual things. Edgar's mother turned to Mr. Benson. It doesn't always make sense when you see it in progress, she said. Go, she said to the dogs jostling at their feet. Kennel up, go. The dogs trotted down the aisle. Edgar went to Essay's pen and grabbed her by the ruff and scrubbed her up, then visited all the rest. Good girl. Yes, good girl, good girl. Everyone had walked out of the barn, and as he praised his dogs, he listened for the Impala starting. But he heard only a hasty parting conversation between his mother and Mr. Benson. It was full dark outside now. If he went to the house, there'd be demands and arguments, and he needed quiet to close his eyes and watch everything again. See the look on Claude's face as Essay tagged him, the flush of blood across his cheeks, the muscle tugging his eyelid. He climbed the workshop stairs and flicked on the lights in the mow, and as the sound of Mr. Benson's truck faded, his mother stormed in. We're going to talk, Edgar, right here, right now. I want to know what that was about. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was? Did you see his face? The look on his face. Whose face, Edgar? Mr. Benson's, who thinks I have a lunatic for a son? Or Claude's, who, by the way, is in the house right now, royally pissed off? He walked between straw bales scattered across the mow floor, then stopped and looked into the rafters. His breath roared in his ears. It's raining, he signed. What? Is it raining? Did you hear rain? He ran to the front of the mow and unlatched the broad loading door and swung it open. He gripped the lintel and hung his body into space and looked into the stars burning in the clear night sky, then out toward the wood. Remember me. He pulled himself inside. Come here, he signed. See for yourself. I can see from where I am. There's no rain. Come away from there. But his patience was spent. He walked to her and tried to pull her forward. When she resisted, he clasped his hands around her neck and swung her toward the mow door. His body counterweighted against hers. Bales and rafters spun around them. His mother tried to get her hands under him and pry him away. They had halved the distance to the mow door when he lost his balance, and they crashed to the floor. In the tumult, he knelt over her and pinned her arms. They panted. He let go and began to sign wildly. Did you help him? Tell me now if you helped him. Help him? Help who? I'll show you who. And he stood again and took his mother's wrist and began to lug her toward the mow door, still hanging open into the night. When she realized what he was doing, she began to kick along the floor to get to her feet. From behind them came a hoarse cry. Not speech, not words, just a groan of apprehension. He looked over his shoulder. Inside the vestibule at the top of the stairs stood the chiaroscuro. I have no idea what that word means, but I'm going to have to look it up. Figure of a man. Edgar dropped his mother's wrist and ran toward the door. So grim and ecstatic and oblivious, he fell over a balustrade and went down, legs kicking. When he had scrambled to his feet again, the hay hook was in his hand. He threw himself at the doorway, hook dragging through the air behind like a great single claw. The figure stepped deeper into the shadows and tried to close the vestibule door, but Edgar struck it headlong before it latched. The door slammed back with a splintering boom. There was a grunt, and then the sound of a body tumbling heavily on the stairs. Then silence. Edgar looked up to find the hay hook driven thumb deep into the timber of the doorframe. He wrenched the thing free and flung it ringing across the mow. His mother had got to her feet and was running toward him, saying, "What was that? What did you do?" But he couldn't answer at first. A savage, goddish electricity ran through his nerves. From his chest, a spasm rose. His hands snapped open and shut so that he could barely force them into sign. I should have done it the first night he stayed here. Only after his mother cried out did he follow her into the vestibule. She was standing halfway down the stairs, the heels of her hands pressed to her temples. At the bottom of the stairwell lay Dr. Papineau, feet askew on a high tread, head on the workshop floor, canted horribly. One of his arms was flung forward, gesturing casually away. Edgar pushed past his mother and stepped over the veterinarian's body. He bent to look. The old man's eyes were skimming over it even then. Tears streamed down his mother's face, and as she descended the stairs, Edgar stood. The muscles of his legs were still twitching with whatever galvanic charge had possessed him in the mow. "Now you cry? You think this is terrible? Don't you have dreams? Isn't he there when you sleep?" "My God, Edgar, this is not your father. This is Dr. Papineau. This is Paige." Edgar looked at the old man lying there, so small and frail. The same man who'd summoned the strength to lift him out of the snow by the back of his shirt. He wasn't so innocent. I heard them talking. His mother put her face into her hands. "How are we going to tell Glenn?" She said, "I don't understand what's happened with you. We're going to have to. She looked at him. "Wait," she said, "I need to think for a minute. Paige fell down the stairs." She dropped into sign. "You need to go." "I'm not going anywhere." "Yes, you are. I want you to run, get out into the field, find a place to hide until tomorrow." "Why?" "Just go." "So you can be rid of both of us?" He didn't see her hand moving any more than the dog saw her leash corrections. A hot jolt traveled from his cheek to his spine. He staggered back against the wall to keep from toppling onto Dr. Papineau's body. The side of his face felt like it had been set on fire. "Don't you dare," she sighed. And she was Raksha now, Mother Wolf. "You're talking to your mother and you will do as I say. I want you to go. Stay away until you see me standing behind the silo alone. Watch in the evening. When you see me, it's safe to come back. Until then, disappear. Even if we call, stay away." He turned and stumbled out of the workshop and into a yard pale and blue in the moonlight. He squinted past the light above the kennel doors, the night sky cloudless. There was no time to fetch tackle. He rounded the barn and unlatched the pen doors and signaled his litter out. 7 dogs bounded onto the grass. Together they ran down the slope behind the barn until they reached the rock pile, and there Edgar sat, senseless, while the dogs milled about. He watched Claude cross from the house to the back of the barn. He closed his eyes. Time passed. Whether a minute or an hour he couldn't have said. Then his mother was calling, "Edgar! Edgar!" Her voice toy-like and shrunken. The stars wheeled in his vision. Impossible that he ever lived there. He stood. He began to run, the dogs beside him. As they reached the woods, a squad car appeared on the road at the top of the hill, blue and red flashers strobing the trees and throwing off a Dopplered siren scream. Glenn Papineau came to find his father. Now there was no going back for Almondine, he thought, and having thought it, found it almost impossible not to turn back. The moonlight was enough to see the 2 birches making the entrance to the old logging trail. The dogs crashed through the underbrush in crazy ellipse, all but Babu, who trailed a few steps behind. The woods were so much darker than the field. He didn't understand how little progress they'd made until the headlights of the squad car, bouncing over the tractor-rutted field, lit the tree trunks in front of him. Spears and creases of white shot between the trees, but Edgar would not turn his dark, adapted eyes back to look. They wouldn't bring the squad car into the woods. It couldn't make headway on the logging path, and there would be no way to turn it around without miring it. 50 yards from the creek, the ground began to slope downward. The dogs were cast wide about him now. When he reached the water, he clapped his hands. Babu had stayed nearby and sat by his lake, panting. Finch materialized from a stand of bracken, followed by Opal and Umbra, like shadows out of shadows. Then Pout and Tinder. In the dark, it took a long time to be sure it was Essay who was missing. He stood again and clapped hard and listened to the water flowing along the creek. Then he could no longer wait. When he walked into the creek, the water covered his ankles, cool and slick. He grabbed the first fence post he touched and hauled it back and forth until it came loose, gasping in its hole. The thing was as heavy as a granite pillar, and he had to kneel in the water to get it to move. When it finally came up, he balanced the rough end of it on a flat rock in the creek. 2 of the dogs bounded into the water even before he could call them, though in the dark he couldn't tell who. He pushed them under the wire, and they stood on the far side and shook off. He clapped for the others. The remaining 4 dogs paced beside the creek, but would come no further. A flashlight beam began to cut through the air overhead. The dogs whined and looked over their shoulders. Finally, Edgar stepped out of the creek and knelt and put his hands in their ruffs and pressed his face against the crowns of their heads. Finch and Pout and Opal and Umbra. Then he stepped back and released them. At first they sat and looked at him uncertainly. Then Finch wheeled and tracked up the slope in the direction they'd come, and the other 3 followed, crashing along his trail. Edgar walked into the shallow water of the creek and scrambled beneath the barbed wire. He lost his footing trying to reseat the post. The hole had filled with mud, and suddenly he found himself lying flat in the water and wet to the sternum. In the end, he had left the post standing cockeyed in the stream. He'd wanted to set it back the right way, but doubted it would make much difference. He sank to the ground on the far bank of the creek. Not 2, but 3 dogs greeted him, Babu and Tinder and Essay having crossed elsewhere on her own terms. They jostled and licked his face and danced around him like savages performing some ancient, unnamed ritual, as though they knew exactly what lay ahead. His hands, when he rose, were covered with clay. A paste of it had begun to dry and crack on his face. He cupped his hands in the creek and emptied the water over his head again and again. Then he stood and turned from everything he knew, and the 4 of them began to make their way into the dark Chequamegon. Am I saying that right? Please leave a comment. Tell me I'm saying it right, or type it out phonetically. That would really be helpful. All right, this was called Flight. Thin remnants of moonlight permeated the woods. Sweet fern arced throat-high over the old logging path, cloaking blackberry canes hidden like saw blades in sheaths. Spray of dark sumac, shafts of birch and aspen, faintly luminescing. Overhead, a pale and narrowing crack divided the forest canopy, marking their way more clearly than any earthly thing. For fear of jutting branches, he held his hands across his face and let the blackberry thorns rip his clothes. Now and then he stopped and clapped for the dogs. They came and snuffled nose and lip against his palm and vanished again, so sure in the dark. He paused, peered after them, shadow upon shadow, all of it. He swung his foot forward and began again. All around, fireflies glowed their radium bellies. Their voices calling after them had long since faded into the creak of tree trunks, flexing in the night breeze like the timbers of a vast ship. They hadn't circled. He couldn't have said how he knew. The direction of the wind, perhaps, or the westering cast of the moonlight. When a stand of birches glowed blue where he expected a gap, he understood the path had fizzled out or they'd lost it. After a time, he came upon the dogs bunched and waiting. He counted noses, then moved his hands about in the dark, trying to understand why they'd stopped. His fingers brushed a wire, barbed and rusted, and weather-split fence post. He slid his hands down the knotted wood until he had located the bottom strand of wire. Then he sidestepped away from the fence post, bent over and tracing the barbs loosely with his fingers. He stopped when there was enough slack to haul the wire up. He clapped twice and the dogs came forward. By touch, he moved them under the wire. Essay first, he guessed, then Tinder, then Babu. They were panting and hot as they went. He rolled under last of all and stood and pointlessly brushed off his clothes, wet and hanging on him like sheets of wax. He looked up, islands of stars in a lake of black, the forest spectral and pathless all around. He set off in a direction he hoped was west. Hours of the night passed. He stopped when the woods opened into a glade. The moon was high and bright, and before him the charcoaled skeletons of trees rose from blue marsh grass. He blinked at the excess moonlight in the clearing and clapped for the dogs. High in the crown of a charred tree, an owl revolved its dished face, and one branch down, 3 small replicas followed. Babu came at once. Tinder had begun pushing into the tall grass, and he turned and trotted back. Edgar clapped again and waited. When Essay did not appear, he led Tinder and Babu into the trees and touched his hand to the ground. The dogs circled and downed. He paced a few steps away and unzipped his pants. His urine seemed to take with it all the warmth in his body. He peeled off his wet shirt and jeans and hung them on a branch and stood there in the night, clad only in underpants. Clammy as they were, he could not bring himself to take them off. He walked back and lay next to Babu. Babu raised his head and looked at Edgar's arm draped across his chest and laid his head down again. When they were all settled, Essay stepped out of a deer track in the sedge. She sniffed the 3 of them and walked to the clearing's edge and peered upward and returned and stood panting until Edgar sat up and set his hand on her crop. She downed and tucked against his back, grunting with what sounded like disapproval. One after another, the dogs heaved sighs and pressed their heads tight to their sides. Edgar lay watching the silhouettes of the owls warp as they scanned the clearing. He wondered if they should have pushed on until they came to water for the dogs. But after so many hours of stilted, cautious movement in the dark, a crashing weariness had come over him. And yet the moment his eyes closed, there lay Dr. Papineau at the bottom of the mow stairs. Edgar gasped and opened his eyes. "You're a murderer," he said to himself. "You get what you get." The next instant, he was asleep. When he woke, the dogs were standing above him like nurses puzzling over a patient, siding along their muzzles and cocking their heads. The ground beside him was still warm from their bodies. He unclasped his hands from between his knees and pushed himself upright. The dogs bucked and wheeled. Essay planted her back feet and walked out her front until the cords quivered in her sides. Babu and Tinder yawned out soft creaks from gaping mouths. The owls were gone. Across the glade, the treetops glowed carmine where the rising sun torched them. His head throbbed. He thought they couldn't have slept more than 2 hours. He sat, arms around his knees, until the unfurling weeds began to tickle his nether parts. He fetched his trousers from the branch where they hung. They were as wet as when he had taken them off, and now cold. He lifted a foot, then stopped and peered down the leg holes. When he had finished dressing, he thought he might as well have clothed himself in wilted lettuce. Babu had stayed beside him, but Essay and Tinder had already slipped into the tall grass, hunting each other. Trails of grass shook, and they dove into the clear and wheeled and plunged back in. He stroked Babu's neck and watched. The dogs had filled out in the last few months. Their chests were thick and deep, their backs broad, and they moved with a powerful leonine grace. He clapped his hands. The grass stopped moving, and Tinder and Essay cantered out. He set them in a row and paced backward and recalled them one by one. They repeated this 3 times. Then he snapped off a dead tree branch and rolled it between his palms to scent it up, and had them each fetch it. They practiced downs and rollovers and crawls, while the birds around the edge of the clearing chattered. They were heated up then, even lackadaisical Babu. He thought they'd better find water. His nighttime fretting seemed pointless. No creek could be far off in the lower Chequamegon. He looked back along the way they'd come. Then he led them around the perimeter of the clearing and picked a spot and set foot in the forest again. After half an hour, they descended a shallower, alder-choked ravine that bottomed out in a creek 6 inches deep and filled with pale green grass laid over the current like mermaid hair. The dogs began to lap at once. Edgar tossed his shoes and socks across and waded in and scooped up a handful of water that tasted like cold, weak tea. He let the water run over his feet until the dogs climbed out and sprawled near a mossy log, and then they moved on. The slant of the morning sunlight made it easy to keep his bearings. They were traversing the ridges west of the kennel, ridges he and Almondina gazed over countless times as they sat on the hill in the south field. He didn't know how far the ridges went on or what they gave on to. They seldom traveled that direction. That old life, suddenly so remote, had been oriented along the meridian of Highway 13, with Ashland to the north and everything else, Wausau, Madison, Milwaukee, Chicago, to the south. So he gave himself just 2 rules: stay off the roads and travel west. Whenever he was forced to detour around an obstacle, he chose the northernmost alternative. Beyond that, he had no specific destination or design, no more than when he had first begun training the dogs on those odds and ends in the mow. He wanted distance from that prior life. He wanted time, later, to think about what had happened and what to do about it. Until then, he wanted to think about the 4 of them and how they should move. He was already beginning to worry about the dogs. He didn't know what to do about food. He didn't even have a pocket knife. Despite himself, he wondered what was happening at the kennel. He thought about Almondine, how he hadn't had a chance to make amends with her. He wondered where she'd slept without him in the house. He wondered if his mother was standing behind that silo that morning, signaling him to return. Perhaps they were still walking through the woods, shouting his name. The thought gave him twinges of both satisfaction and remorse. The jolt of his mother's slap kept coming back to him, and her furious expression, and Dr. Popinow's eyes, the life dimming in them as he watched. His resolve wasn't tested until late that morning when they came to a road cutting through the forest. It was barely more than a dirt track, strewn with gravel and overhung on both sides by trees. So desolate, he felt no qualms about standing in the middle of it. The sun was almost at its zenith. He squinted both directions for mailboxes or stop signs. There was nothing, not even telephone poles. Just washboards ribbed into the dirt. The long, clear line of the road was a surprisingly welcome sight, for the unceasing effort of reading the tangle of underbrush and choosing a path had begun to wear him down. Plus, mercifully, there was a breeze enough in the open to dissipate the mosquitoes, which had progressed from an annoyance to a torment as he and the dogs traveled. Every fern frond and blade of grass they brushed stirred up another cloud of the hateful things. In self-defense, he had broken into a trot, swinging his hands around his head and slapping his face and neck. But the moment he stopped, they descended again, doubly drawn to his overheated skin. He sat on the dirt, legs crossed, and gathered the dogs. An approaching car would be visible miles away, and he wanted to rest for a minute. If the traveling was hard, he thought, at least there was some consolation in watching the dogs. Back at the kennel, S.A. had always been the most delinquent, the hardest to train, and the first to grow bored. But in the woods she was at ease, scouting, acting the huntress, foraging ahead to challenge any oddity she found. A strangely aromatic stump, a chipmunk skittering through the leaves, a drumming grouse. When she was nearly out of sight, she would turn to look back, though not always. Sometimes she charged into the underbrush. It made her a flagrantly inefficient traveler, covering twice as much ground as she needed to. But whenever Edgar tried to keep her nearby, she whined and dropped her ears. Babu was the steadfast one. If Edgar told him to wait, Babu waited like a stone laid upon the earth by God himself, pleased to know his job. That Babu was charmingly literal had always been clear, but in the woods he was a pragmatist. He trotted along behind Edgar as he broke trail, sometimes sticking close at Edgar's heels, sometimes dropping back. But if more than a few yards came between them, Babu crashed recklessly forward to close the gap. Of the three, Tinder was the hardest to pin down. He always stayed in sight, neither shadowing Edgar nor launching himself into the underbrush. But whenever S.A. reappeared from one of her forays, it was Tinder who met her and dropped back to touch muzzles with Babu as if carrying news. Edgar sat in the sun in the road. To the far side was a deep patch of fern, so lush it looked primordial. They ought to get out of the open, he knew. He was still persuading himself to brave the mosquitoes when S.A.'s ears twitched and she turned her head. He followed her gaze. Far down the road, a tiny cloud of orange dust was rising, and a windshield heliographed as it passed in and out of the shade. He scrambled up into a crouch. The car was far away, and at first he felt no rush. If the driver had seen Edgar and the dogs at all, he had probably taken them for deer. Edgar clapped his hands, signed, "Come," and waded into the overgrown bracken. The dogs thrashed along behind him. He dropped into the green shadow world of grass and fiddleheads and worked his way along on all fours. At the back of the thicket, they came to a dense blackberry bramble. The thorns curved and sharp as scalpels. Even if he forced himself through, the dogs would balk. He chided himself for running toward the unfamiliar. He thought there was still time to cross back the way they'd come, retreat into known terrain, though they wouldn't get more than 20 yards into the forest before the car passed. Babu and Tinder were close behind, but S.A. had already turned and begun to nose her way back toward the road. He stayed the two dogs. Babu dropped into a sit like a soldier, and Duck walked through the ferns and tapped S.A. on the hip. She looked at him across her flank. He led her back. When she was sitting again, he raised up into a crouch and peered over the fronds. The car was closer than he expected, 100 yards away and slowing down. There was no way to cross without being seen. There were maybe 15 feet into the ferns, and they had broken a path wide enough to see the dirt of the road. But he guessed they'd be hidden from a moving car. He got the dog's attention, then signed, "Down," his hand rising briefly into the clear. The dogs eased themselves to the ground. S.A. whined and tucked her hind feet under her hips and elevated her nose in a shaft of sunlight, poking it upward in tiny cicadas to take the scent. He laid one arm over S.A. and reached back with the other to touch Tinder, hoping that if he could keep two of them steady, he could count on Babu to follow their lead. The car's bumper appeared through the stems of the ferns, moving slowly. There was the pong of a stone popping from under a tire. S.A. quivered beneath his hand. A white front fender passed his light of sign, then a tire, a black and white door, another tire, the rear bumper. When the car was some distance down the road, he snapped his fingers. The dogs looked at him. "Stay," he signed. He eyeballed S.A. and repeated the command. "That's 2 stays. You better stick." He finished with one finger warningly in front of her nose. She broke into a pant and tipped her hips to the side. He raised his head out of the ferns. The car was a sheriff's cruiser covered with dust as if it had been trolling roads all night. A lone, massive figure sat behind the wheel, arm outstretched along the top of the seat. The brake lights stuttered. Edgar dropped back down into the ferns. He counted to 100. When the only sound was the heat bugs in the noon sun, he released the dogs. They looked at him. He released them a second time to no effect. He understood something was wrong then, and he cautiously raised his head out of the ferns a second time. The cruiser was parked 200 yards further along. Only then could he hear it idling. The driver's side door was open, and Glenn Papineau stood looking down the road, so big he hardly seemed capable of squeezing back in. Edgar fell down into the ferns. "Stay, stay," he signed. S.A. swiped her tail and tucked her feet, and Tinder pressed his muzzle against Edgar's palm with a questioning stare. But in the end, both of them stayed. It was Babu who began to rise, half in curiosity, half in confusion. Edgar clapped once, overly loud. The dog froze and looked at him through the stalks of the ferns. "Down," he signed frantically. "Stay." From up the road, he heard Glenn Papineau's voice. "Edgar?" he called. "Edgar Sawtelle?" Babu lowered himself to the ground, eyes wide. They waited. Edgar heard a door slam and then the faint rumble of the engine as the cruiser pulled away. This time they waited until he began to worry that the road was a dead end and that Glenn might double back. He left the dogs in stays and crept out to the road. There was nothing to see, not even a cloud of dust. He clapped. The dogs bounded out of the ferns and danced about him in a sort of a pageant his mother called the end of down dance. A few yards up the road he found a clear line into the woods, and in another minute the road had disappeared behind them and they passed into the evanescent stipple of the forest at midday. By late afternoon, Edgar was hungry. Had been hungry, in fact, for quite some time. The final vestiges of panic from the night before had been drained by the monotony of breaking trail, and he felt lightheaded and irritable, and his stomach gnawed at him. He wondered if it was the same with the dogs. They didn't seem uneasy. They'd spent all afternoon tramping through underbrush and fording backwoods streams. So far, the dogs had only missed their morning feeding, but he was used to breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and he didn't even have a match to light a fire, much less a plan to get food. He did have something in mind, though. It wasn't exactly a plan, since it depended largely on chance. The woods were dotted with vacation cabins and fishing shacks. What was called the Chequamegon, as if it were a single block of forest, was in fact a Swiss cheese of government-owned forest and private property, particularly around the dozens of lakes. Sooner or later, they were bound to find a cabin stocked with supplies or come across a car with some fisherman's lunch inside. They hadn't seen one yet. He hoped that meant they were due. The problem with that idea, he thought as they reached another clearing, was that cabins and cars were located on roads, not in the middle of the woods, and roads were to be avoided at all costs. The encounter with Glenn Papineau had removed any doubt from his mind about whether anyone was searching for them. If they were spotted, even by someone driving along who later called the sheriff's office to report a boy with a bunch of dogs, they would have had a good idea where he was. Cutting through the woods, however, meant slow going. He doubted they were covering more than a mile every 2 or 3 hours, and with all the underbrush and marshes and the dogs to manage, and the caution with which he needed to pick his steps, a sprained ankle would be a disaster. He wondered if someone might be tracking them with dogs. The woods near the kennels would be so soaked with his scent, the fields so crisscrossed with layers of tracks from his ordinary daily work, and only the purest, most experienced tracking dogs had any chance. And every hour that passed, their track blended farther into the general melange, as there was the question of where they'd find tracking dogs anyway. Sawtelle dogs would be useless. Field tracking was an art they didn't practice. He could hear his mother laugh at the idea. She would tell anyone who suggested it they might as well track him with cows. But away from the kennel, everything changed. Their scent would be undisguised and distinctive, and between the 4 of them, they were laying a scent track a mile wide, as obvious to a real tracking dog as if the ground had been lit on fire. The only way to break such a trail would be to get into a vehicle. But hitchhiking with 3 dogs was as good as walking into the sheriff's office in Mellon, which brought him back again to staying off the roads. He was thinking about this problem, circling it, and drawing out the alternatives in his mind, when through the trees he glimpsed sunlight, reflecting off water. The late afternoon had grown cooler and the wind had calmed. When they reached the water, it was a lake. They walked out onto a small peninsula of sedge and cattails. The shoreline was irregular and densely forested. He scanned for cabins, but all he saw were pines making a sawtooth pattern against the sky and birds diving over the lake, sweeping up insects. Mosquitoes, he fervently hoped. The dogs walked to the water's edge. Having spent no time at lakes, they teared and jumped at all the small waves that washed up onto their feet. They would have had to go around the lake one way or another, because he could see most of the shoreline to the north, but he chose that direction. In the twilight, they came upon a snapping turtle the size of a dinner plate marching toward the water. The dogs gathered around it, rearing as it turned its blunt head, jaws agape and hissing. He rushed over and shooed them away, thinking of the stories he'd heard of turtles' jaws staying locked onto whatever they'd bitten, even after their heads were cut off. He kept his own feet well back from the thing. He didn't want to find out if the stories were true. As soon as the dogs abandoned the turtle, Tinder wheeled and backtracked along its path, then began to whine and dig. In a moment, the other dogs joined in, and dirt was flying through the air. They were gobbling the turtle's eggs, teeth clicking. When Edgar got there, he reached past them and picked up an egg. It was cool and soft in his hand, the size and texture of a leathery ping-pong ball. Looking at it, his stomach did a traitorous little flip. Before his mouth could water any more, he took 3 additional eggs from the rapidly diminishing pile, brushed the dirt off them, and when Babu looked up, he tossed one back. The dog snatched it from the air. Edgar tucked the other 3 in his shirt pocket. It bothered him to see them eating like that, but he had nothing better to offer. When they could find no more eggs, he slapped his leg and turned to pick a place to sleep where there was still some light. He chose a spot under a stand of ash near the water. The sky overhead was a deep cobalt. Suddenly he was bone-tired. He walked the 4 of them out to the lake and let them drink and slipped off his shoes and rolled up his jeans and waded in. His feet stirred up silt in the water and he had to reach far out, overbalancing himself, to ladle up anything clear. Even then it tasted of algae and muck and left grit between his teeth. He drank again. He led the dogs back, carrying his shoes and socks. They curled up at once and he tried to lie between them, but a rock poked his ribs. His clothes had dried during the day, but they felt greasy and lax, and his stomach was bloated with water. He thought he might gag if he dwelt on its taste. Hunger twisted inside him. He got up and found a better position, though he could reach only Essay. Babu stood, grumbling as if to say, "Oh, all right," and moved over and circled twice and settled with his muzzle near Edgar's face. Shortly, Tinder followed. He woke sometime in the night. The dogs lay curled about him in circles of slumber, and somewhere a nightingale was calling, "Old Sam Peabody, Peabody, Peabody." Whatever had roused him had been in his dreams, and then he remembered he was in the air above the workshop stairs, and he was falling. Sunrise, clamor and screech of birds as if the sunlight had set them afire. The dogs stretched where they lay. Immediately he was thinking about food. His belly felt curdled and a coppery tang coated his teeth, as if the minerals in the ground had seeped into him. By the time he sat up, the dogs were snooping in the undergrowth. He called them over one at a time and felt for stickers and burrs, starting with their tails and moving toward their heads. They lay chewing their forelegs as if pulling kernels of corn off a cob as he worked. Occasionally they nuzzled his hands, objecting to some pinch or tug. Then he stayed the dogs and walked each of them out and trotted back and signed a release. When they returned, he reached into his shirt pocket and produced a turtle egg. Tinder first, then Babu. Essay was last, a vain attempt to teach her patience. Having watched the others get their reward, she streaked toward him through the woods the instant he moved his hands. Then they set out again, keeping the lake to their left. The underbrush was sparse compared to the previous day's travel, and they made good time. The morning air was thick with moisture, and their grasses shed water droplets that glistened on the dogs' coats. When they'd rounded the lake halfway, they could see water stretching away in a jagged meander to the south. He was fretting over the problem of food when he glimpsed the first cabin. The sight of it did nothing to ease his mind. He stayed the dogs and walked forward until he understood it could not possibly be occupied. They walked out of the brush together to inspect it. The little shack had collapsed inward many years before. If it had ever been painted, the paint had long since washed into the earth, and now only the roofing shingles, bright purple, hadn't grayed. A scabrous folding chair stood on what remained of the crude front porch, shedding paint flakes the color of dried mustard as rust worked its way underneath. Inside was a calamity of plywood and mossy bed springs and vast spider webs hanging like spinnakers between the timbers. The whole thing covered no more ground than a good-sized tent, 10 feet on a side. The dogs circled and poked their noses into crannies and corners until he called them away for fear of rats and snakes. An hour later, they came to a place at the water's edge where the riotous undergrowth gave way to a small crescent of gravelly sand. Further out, reeds projected through the silver surface. He stripped off his clothes and parted the dogs and waded in. The water was brown with tannin. He was covered with mosquito bites, and the cool hug of liquid soothed the itching. He looked down to see a panfish darting between his knees. The dogs stood watching and wagging their tails, but wouldn't come in the water. He emerged naked and knee-deep, splashing the dogs. They dashed away and back again, ears laid low, crouching and scrambling to dodge the spray, remembering, perhaps, games they'd played in the yard with the garden hose. Part of him was glad he had found something that pleased them, but he quickly stopped. In himself he felt nothing but gloom, and the place seemed false, a pretense that everything was going to be okay. Besides, he began to worry again about working them up. That wasn't right, not until they got real food. Already they looked thinner to him, though that was probably his imagination. They were acting a little too wild, their hunger making them frantic. They stood panting and watching as he swept beads of water off his legs. In a minute or two the sun had dried him enough to dress. This time he flapped his trousers out and looked down the legs and knocked his shoes against his hand without a second thought. The next cabin looked more promising. It was painted a utilitarian green, but it was sturdy and well maintained. A galvanized smokestack pierced its sloped roof. A pair of small windows were set high off the ground on either side of the door. It was so tidy, in fact, he watched it for a while before he was sure it was unoccupied. Even then his skin tingled as he approached. The door was held shut by a padlock threaded through a heavy metal latch. The padlock had been slathered with a grease and wrapped with a plastic bag, presumably to protect it against the elements. He turned the knob and tried a few hard pushes. Then he backed up and took a running start and hit it. He bounced off. He tried again. The structure shook, but the door didn't budge in its frame, and his shoulders began to hurt. The dogs stood and cocked their heads. "It works on TV," he signed. "Shut up." He looked at the windows again. There were 3 paned, top-hinged transom windows set about 6 feet off the ground, big enough to fit through, he thought. He could easily break the glass, but it seemed unlikely he could heft himself through without cutting himself to ribbons. And while he'd been throwing himself at the door, it had occurred to him that it would be best to enter without being obvious. He searched the surrounds for a log or anything that might serve as a boost, to know whether it was worth breaking the window, and help him climb through if it was, but he found nothing useful. He looked for a likely spot to hide a key. Nothing again. He walked to the front of the cabin and looked at the dogs. "We're going back for that chair," he signed, and they set off the way they'd come. He didn't realize how far they would have to backtrack. It took over an hour before he glimpsed the purple shingles again. He grabbed a stick and swept the cobwebs from the chair and yanked it off the porch. Half a dozen spiders scrambled away like rotted berries on logs. The web straps that had formed the seat hung in brown tatters, but the frame itself seemed solid, if rusty. Babu nosed it curiously. Essay and Tinder lay down. All 3 dogs had kept their noses to the ground on their return, no doubt hoping for more turtle eggs. More than once they had bolted after squirrels, gibbering in the underbrush before learning it was a waste of time. Now they were acting dispirited, and a stab of anxiety entered his chest. When they passed the little beach on their return, he was so eager he started jogging along. He set the chair frame beneath one of the transom windows, and he was about to hoist himself up when he checked the impulse and decided to test the chair first. He planted his rump on the arm. One of the crusty front legs crumpled like a paper soda straw. He looked at it in surprise, then flipped the chair over and pressed both hands onto the joint where the back and the seat came together. Satisfied, he stepped onto the frame and put his fingertips onto the windowsill. During the walk back, he had allowed himself to imagine how a fisherman might stock such a neatly kept shack with all sorts of canned goods and tackle, but his view through the window revealed only a bare cot folded against one plywood wall, a prefab fireplace at the base of the galvanized chimney, and a small kerosene stove and a lantern. There was no point trying to get in. It was obvious he'd find no food. And even if the lantern had fuel, which he doubted, it would burn only for a few hours. The camp stove was too unwieldy to carry. He hopped to the ground. He sat beside the crippled chair and chastised himself. A good fisherman would never leave food to lure animals. He should have known that. But instead he talked himself into a fantasy. They'd wasted the better part of the day on a pointless errand. He was so hungry now his insides spasmed. His mouth had watered as soon as the cabin came into view. He'd read somewhere that a person could live for a month without food, but that seemed impossible. Perhaps if that person sat in one place and did nothing, but not if they were crossing miles of unpathed forest. It was too much. With all that had happened at the kennel and now the hunger and the worry about the dogs, and suddenly without Almondine there, it felt like some organ had been ripped from his insides. He brought his knees to his chest and lay over on his side, and he thought he was going to cry, but instead his mind emptied, and he lay staring along the roots and leaves of the forest floor and listening to the far-off sound of the dogs rattling through the underbrush. He stayed like that for a long time. Eventually the dogs returned, Babu first, then Tinder and Essay. They panted and licked his face and stretched out around him, grunting and sighing and finally sleeping. His malaise didn't entirely pass, but it did lighten, and he sat up and looked around. In the distance, a prop plane sputtered. A flock of small black birds with obsidian beaks cackled warnings at one another from lower branches of the trees. He forced himself to stand, and the dogs assembled around him, nuzzling his hands for food. He knelt and stroked their ruffs. "I don't have anything," he sighed. "I'm sorry. I don't even know where, and I will." They walked to the lake shore. In a clearing, he spotted a long, ripe blueberry hanging from a bush. Too early in the season, but there it was. He did not think it was nightshade, but he turned over the leaves to check. The blueberry patch covered a circle of 30 feet or so, and from it he harvested a single handful of ripe berries. He tasted one, then squatted and held them out. The dog sniffed his bounty and walked away. No, try them, he signed. "Come back." But they would not. As soon as he swallowed them, his stomach began to churn. For a moment he thought he might vomit, but he didn't. At dusk he picked a spot to bed down among a grove of maples. They were settled and half asleep when a high, thin whine swelled in the treetops, then hovered downward until it seethed all around them. When he looked at his arm, it was covered in undulating gray fur. He swiped a hand from elbow to wrist, leaving behind a mash of blood and crushed mosquitoes. At once, a rapacious new layer appeared in the slime. Mosquitoes began crawling in his nostrils and ears, and the dogs leapt up and snapped at the air, and Edgar waved his arms and slapped his neck and face, but in the end, they ran, and the dogs disappearing ahead into the gloom. After a while, he halted, gasping and disoriented. The forest floor was covered with a layer of pine needles thick enough to choke the underbrush. He listened for mosquitoes, shuddering. A cloud of them had waited in the forest canopy, and he and the dogs had lain willingly beneath. He'd never heard of such a thing. The dogs trotted out of the gloaming, and they made their beds in the pine needles. He lay looking into the treetops. He was hungry, tired, dejected, and now humiliated. The stomachs of the dogs gurgled as they lay around him. They were going to have to find a road after all, he thought, or they would starve. By the third day, he was doing the math continually. The dogs had eaten nothing but turtle eggs for 2 days. He'd eaten maybe 30 blueberries. One moment he told himself it wasn't a disaster to miss 6 meals. The next moment his stomach pulsed and contracted. Squirrels and birds were everywhere, but he had no idea how to catch one. The lakes were probably brimming with fish, but he didn't have a single inch of monofilament line, much less a hook. They heard the moan of the tires along the blacktop half an hour before they reached the road. From behind a balsam, they watched a ragged procession of cars pass, then snuck to the embankment and bolted into the woods on the far side and began following the highway as they'd followed the shoreline the day before, staying well hidden in the forest. Twice, streams too deep or marshy forced them back to the road to wait and dash across a bridge before they could move on. In the afternoon, they came to a field of sedge and chokecherry, about 1/4 of a mile wide and several hundred yards deep. Halfway to the back tree line, Edgar stopped and looked at the road. On the one hand, they would be exposed if they crossed there, but on the other hand, he was starting to tire, and it was a significant shortcut. The grass was tall enough to hide the dogs. He could duck if a car appeared. They'd crossed halfway when something chittered through the grass, and Tinder leapt after it, and the other dogs after Tinder. Edgar caught up with them, dancing around a burrow entrance. Out on the road, a car was approaching. He dropped to all fours and waited. For some time, the faraway burr of a small airplane had been swelling and fading. And when it began to swell again, he craned his neck and looked up. He saw nothing against the blue sky. The burr grew louder and then louder still. The moment the car passed, he clapped the dogs out of their stays and bolted. By the time he dove into the birch on firing in the airplane engine, on the far side of the clearing, he could almost hear the individual cylinders firing in the airplane engine. The dogs had stuck close by him for once, and he huddled them underneath the dogwood. When the airplane passed over, it was so low he could read the Forest Service insignia. Idiot, he thought. You were going to stay in the woods? They kept hidden there for the better part of an hour, tracking the sound of the airplane as it progressed north and south along its search pattern. After he got the dogs moving again, he kept them strictly under tree cover, circling even the smallest glades. Mid-afternoon, they came to a gravel road tightly enclosed by pine forest. There were power lines strung along creosoted poles. A few hundred yards east, the road intersected the blacktop. They tracked it in the opposite direction, staying back in the woods. The dogs had begun moving with their tails down, edgy and wild-looking. 70 hours in the counting part of his brain. 1 turtle egg for every 4 hours, 1 blueberry an hour for him, half a blueberry. They watched his station wagon rumble back with its backwash of brown dust. They walked to the tree line ahead, and when the road curved, he saw the first cabin, then the lake glittering behind it, then all the other cabins nestled among the trees, posts with reflectors marking the driveways over the lash of waves against the lakeshore. He heard a boat motor sputtering and the cry of sandpipers and inland gulls. The station wagon had rounded the curve and driven on. He led the dogs along until they were across from the nearest cabin. No car in the grassy drive. The dogs knew something was happening, and they circled and poked one another with their muzzles and hopped ticklishly. Down, he signed. They whined, but complied, one after another. Stay, he signed, stay. He slipped into bad habits already, he thought. Repeating commands was minor. Failing to trust them, far worse. He forced himself not to repeat the stay a third time and walked out to the road and looked back. The dogs lay panting in the forest shade, watching him. He turned and walked up the cabin driveway, trying to look as if he belonged there. There was no fisherman's shack. A window sash had been raised, curtains ruffled in the breeze behind the screen. A Formica table sat beneath the window, covered with folded newspapers and a scattering of mail. Ceramic cows labeled S and P curtsied to one another. Beyond, he saw a kitchen with plain cupboards and an icebox and a stove. The counter was strewn with cellophane packages, cookies, potato chips, loaves of bread. His hands were shaking now. He tried the front door, but it was locked. He returned to the window. In the back of the cabin was a screen door, latched with a hook and eye. He rattled the door. The hook wouldn't shake loose. He turned to look around. No one sunbathed on the beach. No one swam off the dock. He trotted into the nearby woods and came back with a short, blunt stick, and he punched a neat line of screening away from the center bar of the door and threaded his arm through and popped the hook and swung the door open. He stepped over the jumble of toys on the living room floor, and then he was in the kitchen, throwing open the cupboards. Cans of SpaghettiOs and pork and beans stood in neat rows, besides Kraft macaroni and cheese, Jiffy Pop, hot dog buns, bread. In the icebox, he found hot dogs, mustard, ketchup, relish, 2 6-packs of beer. He grabbed all the hot dogs, then, thinking better of it, put one package back. He set out the cans of SpaghettiOs and pork and beans. He rifled the drawers and slipped a can opener into his back pocket. Then he lost patience. He'd gathered up his loot and he was heading for the back door when something on the Formica table caught his eye. The pepper cow stood atop a white mimeograph page titled in big blue letters. He could only see the first half. Run Awkwardly, he set the food down, slipped the sheet from under the newspaper. The pleasant odor of mimeograph fluid rose off the paper. There was a poorly reproduced photograph from the school yearbook, and beneath it a short notice. Edgar Sawtelle disappeared June 18, age 14. Height 5 feet 6 inches, black hair. Boy cannot speak, though he may use written notes or sign language. He may be accompanied by 1 or more dogs. Last seen wearing blue jeans, sneakers, and brown and red checkered short-sleeve shirt near Melon. Before he could finish reading, he heard a bark from the direction of the woods. He stuffed the notice in his pocket, scooped up the canned goods and wieners. Outside, he had to dump everything on the ground again to reach through the ripped screen and set the hook into the eye. Then he smoothed the screen back into place as best as he could, gathered up the food, and ran across the gravel road. Essay stood waiting a few feet inside the edge of the woods, Tinder and Baboon not far behind. He put them all in downstairs sternly, and then turned and fumbled with the can opener. He poured SpaghettiOs into 3 widely separated piles. The dogs moaned. He signed a release, and they pounced, and the SpaghettiOs were gone. But he was already ripping open the wieners and stuffing one into his mouth and handing them out to the dogs. Then he came to his senses. Somewhere he'd read that people who tried to eat after long stretches without food threw it up. Though he felt in no danger of that himself, only a comforting sensation in his middle. Probably that wisdom had been written by the same person who could survive for a month without food. They had lasted 3 days, but it would be foolish not to wait a few minutes just to be sure. The dogs scoured the ground where the SpaghettiOs had so briefly lain, while Edgar counted out 100 breaths. The wieners were salty. They made him thirsty, but that was okay. That was just fine. He picked up the remaining food and retreated to a clearing out of sight of the cabins. It was the friendliest looking place he had seen in days. He sat down Indian style while the dogs gathered around him, transfixed. And like a magician performing sleight of hand, he began working the opener over a can of pork and beans. We'll stop there. Thank you for sticking with me and with all our technical difficulties. But we're going to try and get through this. It's going to be some long, some hour-long cycles, but I wanted to get through it before the end of the year so we can start the new year with a new book. I hope you have a wonderful day. Leave me a comment and make sure you subscribe.